Hey everyone, welcome to Pop Culture Pastor, where we look at movies, music, comics, and more from the perspective of faith. Well, welcome to the show, everyone. This is your self-proclaimed pop culture pastor, Chris Perry, and this is our second episode of End of the Year coverage. So today we are talking about the best music of 2022. So I'm joined by the, I would say, senior music correspondent for Pop Culture Pastor, Blake Jackson. Happy to have you back on the show, Blake.
I'm really glad to be here, and I appreciate the title.
Of course, I'm handing them out left and right. I've got a Tolkien correspondent. I think I've got a Beyonce correspondent. So music is actually a little too general.
Yeah,
So
that's very niche.
yeah,
A Beyonce correspondent
hmm
and a
well,
Tolkien correspondent.
we'll try and find you a niche title by the end of this episode.
Let's do it.
So Blake was on our episode about the 1975, the Haunted by Transcendence. So you can go back and listen to that one to get his spiritual bio and some of his earliest interests. But we're not going to do that today. Again, we're just going to get right into it. So as we're thinking about the music of 2022, Blake, were there any trends that you saw, things that kept coming up either in what was popular or in just what you were listening to? What did you notice, kind of big picture, before we start talking about albums and songs and things?
Yeah, I mean, I guess probably the biggest trend that I think I observed this year that I would call a continuation of a trend from the last couple of years, which is like the resurgence of jazz
Hmm.
as a genre of sort of like mainstream critical favor, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so this year, one that immediately come that or the couple that immediately come to my mind were the two from Jeff Parker, the guitarist from Tortoise. He had one at the very beginning of the year called For Folks, and then one just a few weeks ago that dropped called Mondays at the Infield Tennis Center, and which they're both like improvisational jazz guitar records and
Hmm.
both like tons of critical acclaim and interest. And then the Alabaster Deplume
Mm-hmm.
record Gold, which is on my top 10 for the year. Which again is improvisational saxophone, jazz. And then there's a few other like classical jazz type records that have been out there that garnered a ton of attention. So probably the biggest one would be the continuation of the jazz trend. And then probably the other one, I would say, and again, it's a couple years now that I've seen it, but the continued exploration of the inner self
Mm-hmm.
through records, and not just in the sort of like self-lacerating emo way, but
Right, like
in
everybody sings about themselves all the time,
yeah,
but yeah, it's
yeah,
something
exactly.
deeper.
Yeah. It's sort of, yeah, it's a deeper exploration of like hangups and attachments. And, of course we'll talk about Kendrick Lamar, but
Right, yeah,
but
it's
his but
therapy.
Mr. Morale and the yeah, Mr.
Yeah.
Morale and the Big Steppers is sort of indicative of a broader trend of like going to therapy in public.
Mm-hmm.
Which I would say so probably jazz, the proliferation of jazz sort of in the indie mainstream, and then therapy rock.
Therapy rock. I love it. Yeah, that probably fits several that are on my list as well. And I think kind of related to that, there's this question I think that kept coming up from different perspectives or different directions from a lot of artists is like, how do we find joy and how do we find meaning when the world is still on fire? Like
Mm.
it's been a few years, since the pandemic and everything else that seems to be going crazy. And so it's like, okay, that's all still there, but like we can't just keep focusing on the issues. We need to think about, okay, how do we, find meaning in the middle of this, and seeing the way different artists answered that with like focusing on wonder or on love or relationships or body positivity, loving yourself or community. To me, they were all kind of touching on that because it's like, yeah, things aren't going to just get better or go back to normal, whatever that was. And so how do we exist in this space and not get stuck, being overly self-reflective, even though that's good, but to see outside of ourselves and see what there is that's positive.
Yeah, you know what, that reminded me, like, I think naturalism and the environment
Mm,
also were kind of a heavy, it's interesting. I feel like, through the Trump years, there was like obviously like a really big sort of push back into like, agit pop, agit rock,
hmm.
political sort of stuff.
Yeah, anger.
And yeah, and then in the last couple of years, I feel like there's less of that and more of like a retreat into nature,
Mm, hmm.
from a number of like notable records. So I think obviously of the Big Thief record,
Hmm.
Dragon New Or Mountain, I Believe in You, and the Alex G record,
Hmm.
Say the Animals, that kind of dig into that. Pine Grove's record 1111 is kind of more, it's a little more dire, but is, kind of in the woods. It's kind of a crunchy, album. And
Yeah.
and then you hear some of that too on like the Wilco record, Cruel Country, from this year, where there's politics, but then there's this sort of like backing into the tall grass and laying down, the that I think is kind of out there too. So it's really interesting because I feel like whether it's the sort of like therapy thing or the looking for meaning, um or the sort of going back to nature, those are kind of unexpected directions, I think,
Hmm.
for like popular music.
Yeah, but it was kind of a welcome surprise to me.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah,
you're
yeah.
saying, you can't just stay in that place of anger. And maybe this is me getting a little pastoral here of like, yeah, there is still plenty in the world to be upset about and angry about. But if you just live in that space forever, it kills you. And so that was, I think, kind of the positive that I saw. And at least so much of what I loved is like, okay, how can we find good even in the midst of this? Not like the sense of ignoring the problems of the world, but that we're not going to live in that space all the time. So that was something that connected with me because I'm trying to do the same, and I know a lot of people are. One of the other things I noticed, at least just like in my personal taste, maybe this is really just a realization about something that's been true for a while, is that my two main genres of music, I guess you could say, are either sad dad music or teen girl music. We'll see how those play out in a lot of my picks. Really, the sad dad stuff seemed to be the better stuff, but I still like a lot of the teen girl stuff. I think one of the reasons that I like the 1975 so much is they're kind of both. That they're hitting that sad dad stuff with the search for meaning, but also it's that teen pop kind of stuff. So that was just something I noticed about myself. So the sad dad vibe is definitely a thing that's being named. I mean, the National, they only put out one song this year, but like they're selling merch that says "Sad Dad" on it, which is like they just know who they are, and that's great because that's
I'm
who
here
we are.
for it. I think I know when you and I became sad dads, but I'm less familiar from our history, Chris, of when you became a teen girl music fan. Like I'm very curious about the genesis of that.
I would have to be a little reflective and think back through my history. I think some of it is really like when we were in college or right after that, you're like early 2000s, it started to be more acceptable to listen to pop music and take that seriously. And so, like, we don't have to be embarrassed about liking, like, back then it was Justin Timberlake. Like, this has been a shift, I think, in the last 20 years of there are good genres of music to there is good music in every genre. That didn't used to be the way people talked, even if it was still true for sure. And so just more acceptance of hey, you can like this kind of stuff, and that they overlap a little more than what you might think. I at least will talk a little bit about Taylor Swift. She didn't make it in my top 10, but right, like she's kind of gone back and forth in those worlds. She's done music with one of the guys from the National, and yet a lot of her stuff is just pop music. And so I don't know where that started. It's sometimes that's escapism, I guess. You can't always listen to people, therapy rock. So having something you can dance to, I think is I need that too.
I think I've no, and I wouldn't say this is a trend per se, so much as maybe just the natural sort of outworking of what you just described. But it's way more common now to have bands do records that kind of catch everything anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And and I mean, again, I know we're gonna talk about spend some time on the Big Thief record, but as an example, that's like a everything and the kitchen sink
Mm-hmm.
record. And when you listen to it, it's got new wave and it's got, folk and it's got country and it's got, rock and roll, it's got noise, it's
Mm-hmm.
got there's some glitch elements in a couple of places on it. And so found sound and all sorts of like, just it's
Mm-hmm.
just a total mishmash. And I think I probably, to your point, like I probably enjoy a lot more listening to a record like that where the quote unquote vibe is a really hard to capture thing
Mm-hmm.
than something where there's a through line that's really consistent from one end to the next.
Yeah.
And as I'm like sitting here looking down my list, I don't think there's a single one of these records, except for maybe the Angel Olsen record, that I would call like a genre exercise. And I mean that in a generous way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Sure.
mean that in a bad way, but like I don't think there's one record on this list that's just one thing the whole time. Even looking at things like in the hip hop genre, whether it's like Kendrick or Vince Staples or Pusha T or Kenny Beats or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
even those records, there's a ton of diversity and of like sounds and the way sounds bump up against each other and stuff in that. And so whether it's themes, whether it's sounds, whether it's whole genres, I think I'm a sad dad or teen girl or whatever. I'm a big fan of having that, variance
Mm-hmm.
in my listening experience now.
All right. Well, since you're our guest, I'll let you take the first pick, and we're not going to go like 10 to 1 on our top 10, but we'll kind of go starting a little lower and then moving up, and we'll see where we we overlap a little bit, or maybe not at all. Who knows? So, where do you want to start going through your list?
I think I want to start with a few records that are from bands that have been around a long time that I've listened to for what feels like forever, maybe 15, 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
But still are putting out, or at least this year anyway, put out several great records. So, I really enjoyed Wilco's Cruel Country. Thought it's probably the best Wilco record of their late era. And again, like a really interesting mix of like some political music with some pretty spacey jams
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, so it's some of the best writing that I think Jeff Tweedy's done in probably the last 10 years, both lyrics and some of the best singing too. So really enjoyed that. I thought the Spiritualized record, Everything Was Beautiful, was really excellent and reminded me probably most of his work on Let It Come Down, which was an early 2000s record and really really great stuff. I thought Animal Collective Time Skiffs was kind of a
Mm-hmm.
return to form.
Yeah.
It sounded probably the most like Meriwether Post Pavilion and had some of those elements that made that record such a classic. Which I just totally forgot how long ago that was, but that was like 2008 or 2009. So it's good to have Animal Collective back.
Yeah, they were one that I never like at the time I didn't get into for whatever reason. I don't know why. And so yeah, I enjoyed that record, but I wasn't coming to it as most people where I was a fan 15 years ago. And so yeah, it didn't hit me the same way that it probably hit you and most people that love that band. But yeah, I enjoyed that one.
Yeah, probably maybe my second favorite song of the whole year is on that record. It's the song's called Strung with Everything,
Mm-hmm.
and it's oh man, it's so fantastic. It's like a romantic song using like quantum physics as its base metaphor. So it really it's which is very, sort of Animal Collective. And then probably like the best record from a kind of older band that came out this year, in my opinion, was Spoon's Lucifer on the Sofa. I just thought it was really, really excellent. It's in my top 10, super tight. The songs on it are some of their punchiest. I mean, Spoon's is so well known for doing all sorts of interesting things in the studio that aren't not like with effects. It's kind of like the movie studio that doesn't use,
Mm-hmm.
CG
See,
to make an action movie, or
practical
whatever.
effects.
Yeah, it's all sort of analog stuff that Spoon does in the studio, and but their sort of MO for the last, oh gosh, 5 or 6 records, probably since Girls Can Tell, has been, kind of what they don't put on the record, and the, judicious use of white space in the sound that makes the records that Spoon does kind of really interesting and kind of earwormy, even though it's kind of basic instrumentation. But Lucifer on the sofa this year, and you're going to hear this as a theme from me for all the albums that are near my top, is like it's kind of maximalist.
Hmm.
It's kind of Spoon doing the maximalist sort of down the center rock and roll thing, and it's just really, really excellent. So that's a few from just kind of, what I might call like geriatric millennial rock and roll acts. They delivered this year, and
Yeah.
I was really, really pleased, because sometimes when older bands come out with records, contemporary records, they're not too great, but these were all pretty good.
Yeah, yeah. The bands, it's like, well, I'll still listen to it because I loved them in college, but they're not really at the same level. But yeah, there's some that are. It's amazing how consistent they can be. The National is the one that does that so well. Like I said, their only song they put out this year was called "Weird Goodbyes." It was the National with Bon Iver, which again, like that's peak sad dad right there. Just those artists, and it's a song about it's a dad who's leaving the family for some reason, maybe a divorce, something like that, and just the strangeness of those goodbyes, and it's like, why am I doing this? And so yeah, that was one of my favorite songs this year of a band that I've loved for quite a while. Actually, I think I'm going to talk about the teen pop stuff first and kind of get it out of the way, because I'm guessing this wasn't on your list, but Taylor Swift had a record this year, Midnight's, and
Who?
that actually didn't really make it on my list. But it just feels like you kind of have to talk about her at the end of the year, for a wrap up. I mean, the anti-hero, "It's me, hi, I'm the problem, it's me" is definitely a meme-worthy line. But this to me, this album just kind of shows that she is a great songwriter, but she makes some odd choices about which songs to include or make her singles, and tends to not make the best choices. So like she, dropped this whole album with no singles, and then that same night she put out like an extended version with 7 more songs. So it's like, okay, that's not part of the album, but it is. And the best song on the album was in those bonus tracks, "Would Have, Could Have, Should Have," which was produced by Aaron Dessner from the National. So there's my connection. And so it was kind of her picking from different eras in her life, but to me, too much of it was like the Reputation era. I don't care about my haters stuff. That like, well, the more you talk about it, the more I am not sure if you mean it. And so there's some good stuff on it, but yeah, it wasn't my favorite of hers. The other one that I'm slightly embarrassed to admit how much I listened to this was Harry Styles' album "Harry's House." I'd never really listened to Harry Styles before. I was not a One Direction fan, so I don't listen to all of the teen pop music. And so it just came out in the middle of summer, and that's kind of what it was, right? It's like a good summer pop album. I think on NPR they talk about rosé wave, and this is definitely in that vibe of, it's just like, yeah, you got a glass of wine, you're just chilling, you can listen to Harry Styles. He's not terribly original. He maybe isn't the best songwriter. There's a song called "Cinema," and I thought that the word was cinnamon, and it really makes no difference to the the song and what it's about if you change those out. So okay, there's not a lot to it, but sometimes that's the vibe you need, and Harry Styles is definitely a vibe. All right, well, moving to something a little more serious, an album that came out, I think right about the same time. There was a lot of good releases, like in mid-May, I remember. So one of the biggest releases was Kendrick Lamar's "Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers." So we've already talked a little bit about that as therapy rock. So where'd that rank for you? That was in my top 10, but it was kind of near the bottom for me because my feelings were mixed. Is how I'll start. So what did you think of Mr. Morale?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really fair assessment of it. I wrote, in my notes, I wrote that I thought that record has some of Kendrick's best ever and some of his worst ever tracks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, going back when it first hit and I listened to it, I definitely thought it was among his best records. I think on reflection, I probably put it middle of the pack.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for my list, it was right in the middle. It's like
Yeah.
number 4, number 5, kind of in
Mm-hmm.
that zone. I mean, tracks like United in Grief, not beyond just like the wordplay and the rhyming, the production just incredible on that
Mm-hmm.
track.
I grieve different. I grieve different. Huh.
It sounds like a Radiohead song, and
Mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah, the
really
drums are
great.
real
Oh my
intense.
gosh. In 95, Father Time, and then obviously Mother I Sober at the very end, just an
Ooh.
absolutely devastating track.
Yeah.
And there are so many moments on the record where it is extraordinarily uncomfortable to listen to,
Mm-hmm.
but feels like essential to do it.
Well, the way I think of it is, it's like there's some movies that you just watch them once, right? Like you need to watch Schindler's List, but you're not gonna put it on
Yeah,
while you're folding laundry, right? Or 12 Years a Slave, right? They're just
yeah,
so intense and they're doing good things. I think Mr. Morale is kind of the album equivalent, which I don't think of albums working like that usually, but that was my experience of like, there is a lot of good here. I can't just sit and listen to this, right? Like I'm
yeah.
not going to be in my office doing work listening to Mr. Morale. It's
No.
like you have to be focused on that and nothing else. And it's just, you can't do that a whole lot. I mean, there's one track, We Cry Together, I think, where it's just an
Oh my
argument
gosh.
between two people. It's like, you listen to that once, like, okay, I got it.
That's that's how I was about the Passion of the Christ.
No, yeah, that's
Like
another
I've
one
watched it
time.
one time.
Yeah, which the more you think about it, is probably a little problematic for other reasons, but that's another podcast. Yeah, so I'm gonna try and use a baseball metaphor, which you're the one wearing a Kansas City Royals hat right now, not me. But Kendrick only takes big swings, right? That's what he does. He does it well. I would say his last 3 albums have been home runs. Some a little more successful than others, but Good Kid, Mad City, Damn, and To Pimp a Butterfly those are all excellent records. And this was a big swing, but I don't think it was a home run. Maybe it was a double. I don't know. Again, I'm not a baseball fan, so.
Yeah, I mean, you and I are both veterans of going to therapy,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, therapy is ugly.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's cathartic and it's healthy and it's good, but you kind of have to go through it, and there's only one way to go, and that's through it.
Yeah.
And it can be really, really tough and really ugly and really hard. And I think this record captures that really well.
Kendrick, there's such a high bar on Kendrick. It's that straight A student that if he does B level work, you're like, oh, I'm so disappointed in you.
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit of that. But yeah, I mean, like you said, I think one of the ways I've heard people talk about it is it's like a therapy session as a stage play. And so he is trying to put this out there, and it's not the thing you want to listen to all the time. But one of the things I did love is this is him like really getting personal. You wouldn't before this, you wouldn't have said like, oh yeah, I wish Kendrick Lamar would be more personal with him sharing growing up in Good Kid, Mad City, or there's plenty of struggles, personal struggles, and To Pimp a Butterfly and Damn as well. But I think in this we're kind of seeing like he's admitting that I was still actually kind of presenting something, and I have to be honest about actually what some of my struggles were with sex addiction and other things like that. And the line, and I think it's the last song, maybe it's like the last song of "I choose me, I'm sorry." It's just acknowledging I can't be your savior, right? He says that multiple times through it, that Kendrick Lamar is not your savior. And
Mm-hmm.
part of the reason people think of him as their savior is he kind of set himself up to be that. And so this is him realizing, okay, I put myself on too much of a pedestal, and I have to be more honest about who I am. So that's what I loved about it. But yeah, some of it didn't work. Like Auntie Diaries, I think that song is probably one of his bigger misses, because he's trying to do something and acknowledge ways that he's grown or changed by, in how he's understood gender and issues of sexuality. But I think there was the way he does that, a particular word that he repeats over and over is like the thing that he's trying to do, he actually makes it worse. I'm not sure about, the more I listened to it at first, I was like, wow, this is shocking or interesting. But like you said, there sometimes he seems like he's just trying to be provocative, which is not really productive. Same thing when he's talking about the pandemic or cancel culture. Sometimes, like, what are you actually trying to say here, Kendrick? It didn't seem like it was as well thought out as we expect from him. And I also didn't like that the end of the album is like literally self-congratulatory. Like he's written this, but then he's having his partner say, "Hey, you did it. You broke a generational curse. Say thank you, Dad." And then his kids say thank you. It's like, I mean, again, if you know therapy, it's not like okay, you did it, right? You did
Right.
therapy and you're successful at it. And so that's done. I would think he would know, and I'm pretty sure he does know, that it's not that simple, but like that coming right at the end of the album kind of just like leaves it on a sour note for me, even though, like I said, there's a lot to love about it.
Yeah, I wonder, not to get too deep into things I have no idea about because I don't know the man, but therapy is a tool of the privileged,
Mm.
right? And in a number of ways, the biggest one being that it's pretty expensive to do, but the other one being that it's like highly stigmatized in some cultures
Mm-hmm.
and some subcultures. And I think part of the value of what Kendrick does here, I think he does a really good job of destigmatizing the work of therapy.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the journey across the record of him. Like, I don't need therapy, and then
Yeah.
it's like, no, this.
Yeah, and I think, a thought that I had early on when I was listening to the record and feeling how uncomfortable it was to listen to was like, if listening to this record causes someone who previously was highly suspect of the process of therapy, or maybe even more than suspect, was sort of would put it down, or would call someone weak for needing it or doing it or whatever, then I think that would probably be a success. And again, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know the man. I don't know the man. I don't know what he's doing. And I definitely don't want to ascribe, you know, even more of sort of like the savior complex thing onto him when he's clearly trying to shrug a good amount of that off. But, you know, I think it seems to me that he understands, and whether he likes it or not, he's the voice of a generation,
Mm-hmm.
and that to have the voice of the generation embrace destigmatizing the therapy itself, or any number of the issues and attachments and things that he explores over the course of the record,
Yeah.
Sexual, socio-political, etc. I think that's a gift.
Mm-hmm. It's not one you're going to come back to a lot, but like you said, I'm glad it exists. It's doing some important things. There's a few more asterisks on this one than maybe some of his other work. All right. Well, you mentioned other hip hop, so do you want to talk about some other hip hop albums that you love this year?
Yeah, I really, really enjoyed the Pusha T record. It's Almost
Mm-hmm.
Dry.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Although I will say the thing I enjoyed maybe even more than the record was his appearance on Jimmy Fallon,
I haven't seen that.
when oh my gosh, you've got to look it up, where Jimmy is asking him all about the record and what it means and everything. And he is being, of course, the whole record is about cocaine and the drug trade. And not that I know from experience, it's just, you know, very clear, and a quick
Yeah.
search on Genius will help
Yes.
clear up those things. But he keeps explaining it to Jimmy in this way that's just very sort of like bubblegum, primetime late night television way.
Yeah.
And it's adorable.
Okay.
But yeah, but that record was great. I mean, what I really like about that record, and I can't remember if this one's on your list or not, but
He was in my honorable mentions.
okay. So he splits production duties. Half of the tracks produced by Kanye, half of the tracks produced by Pharrell Williams. And it's coming on the heels of Daytona, which was the 7-song record he put out
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
in 2019 where Kanye produced the whole thing. And Daytona was amazing. I mean, it was
Mm-hmm.
tight, and it was super compressed and grimy, and I mean, just sounded like the thing it was describing for the whole record.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really interesting to me listening to It's Almost Dry is the way he's sequenced the tracks, he goes basically not 100%, but basically from Kanye to Pharrell to Kanye to Pharrell to Kanye to Pharrell to Kanye, the whole way through the record. And so you get, while the subject matter doesn't change, and it's all sort of like, the streets and drugs and all that sort of stuff, the sound sort of journey that it takes you on, going from Kanye's current sort of production style, which is again distorted and compressed, and and when he's flipping old tracks, he's flipping them in ways that are less sugary sweet, and more sort of dastardly and all this sort of stuff.
I was dreaming of a It's levels, it's layers, so pray for the players. We hollowed the walls and back up bodegas. I got plenty. It's so many, yeah. They say give me.
Jumping from that to sort of the space age, classic like Pharrell Williams, production sound and stuff like that. And I think it works. I think it's endlessly interesting. And then the very end of that record, the song "I Pray for You," which he has Malice, his brother from Clips, come back and kind of go as a duo. And yeah, Pusha T, It's Almost Dry. And then Vince Staples, Ramona Park, Broke My Heart.
Mm-hmm.
That was great. Probably his best record, I would say, since Summertime '06. Very autobiographical, even more so than usual. Again, kind of deals with like the sort of ugly dark side of, of course he's kind of singing about Long Beach and gang life and stuff like that, and kind of really kind of faces some of the darkness there, in ways he was kind of more playful with on previous records. So I love that one. And then probably the other one on my list would be Kenny Beats Louie.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah, so it's actually not. I mean, it's hip hop record in that it's a record of hip hop beats, but it's largely wordless. And I think you and I have talked a couple times this year about Jay Dilla and my sort of almost 20 years on rediscovery of Donuts. And I probably listened to Donuts more than I've listened to any record this year that's come out this year. And I think the Kenny Beats record has some moments where you're like, oh, he captures a little bit of the like Jay Dilla magic, but then tossed into that, he's got some of like the Avalanche's kind of hip hop type stuff. I really dig the Kenny Beats record. So those would be the other three beyond the Kendrick record that I've really enjoyed this year from hip hop. What about you?
Yeah, really, that's been about it. All the ones you mentioned, aside from that last one, are kind of the ones that stood out to me. I always love Vince Staples, and really, the one he put out this year is kind of a companion to his self-titled one from last year that I also enjoyed. And yeah, Pusha T. All right, well, shifting gears a little bit. Well, one that I kind of feel like we have to talk about because our last podcast was all about them, and it ranked very highly for me, but you kind of made it sound like it didn't rank as highly for you. So that's the 1975's Being Funny in a Foreign Language. Again, if you go back and listen to our previous podcast, it's a band that we both love because, they're always trying to answer this question of where do we find meaning in this modern secular world? And, their previous album, Notes on a Conditional Form, just seemed like it was so scattered and all over the place. It came out in 2020, even though it was recorded before, but, seemed very appropriate to 2020. And so this is, I think, kind of that trend that I was talking about earlier. This is a good example of they're trying to find this focus again. And so this album to me is like the 1975 at their most distilled. It's just kind of them doing what they do best. And it was only like 45 minutes, which is like half the length of their previous album. And, generally I like shorter albums, like get in, do what you want to do, need to do, and then get out. And so that's what they did. And kind of to me, what this is about, the answer to where do we find meaning is it's in love, which, I mean, that seems so like simplistic and cliche. And it's just like Matty Healy's songwriting. He's able to do that, right? He can do these kind of cliche things or say things that seem so simple, but it still comes across as sincere. And one of the things that I liked about it is that like the way it starts actually is a great setup. And in the song called the 1975, like the feel of the song is kind of anxious. So in this song, it's like you're feeling the anxiety of this moment. He sometimes names the pressures, kind of like Love It If We Made It, but not repeating that song again. It's very self-referential. He says we're making an aesthetic out of not doing well, which is a pretty good summary of the 1975. But after that song, the whole album just shifts to like just joy. I mean, literally the next song is called Happiness. And, it's, again, it seems cliche, but like when the world is too much, we find meaning in our relationships. To me, I understand if people didn't love this record because there's not as much to it. So like it's not doing as much as A Brief Inquiry into Online Relationships. Their album titles are always so much. But it doesn't need to, right? They don't need to repeat that. So like the song that I think sums up whether you love this album or hate it is I'm in love with you. Because that's the chorus. He just repeats, I'm in love with you over and over. And, I think I was reading somebody who was talking about, he's trying to figure out the right words. And one of the band members suggested, well, just say that. And he's like, okay, that's all I need to say. And, okay, that is too simplistic. And sometimes you want to say a lot more, but sometimes like that just hits right. And at least for me, that sentiment just hit. Like the first time I listened to it, I was just like smiling the whole time and just loving it. So I don't know, you said you maybe weren't as big on it. What was your reaction to being funny in a foreign language?
Well, I should clarify. I think I liked it.
Mm-hmm.
I liked it. I think it was a little bit of a victim of its time, of the timing of its release for my year. Like it came out. I haven't been able to do a ton of listening the last several weeks just because of life things. So I haven't been able to dedicate the amount of attention that I would normally dedicate to a 1975 record, and that you have to. But I will say on, the first like 5 listens or so, I think what I found myself doing was getting 3 or 4 songs in and then jumping over to Notes on Conditional Form or jumping over into A Brief Inquiry and looking for this again, like we were talking about earlier, the variance of the sound or the variance of the experience in listening to it. And I don't know what it's not that being funny in a foreign language is bad songwriting. It's amazing. I mean, to your point, like it does the thing that it sets out to do extraordinarily well. Like it's really, really good at doing it. I just, for some reason, I have become a little bit addicted, I think, to the approach that they've taken with the last couple of records where there's just everything going on and there's a big jump from track X to track Y and all that sort of stuff. And I felt myself missing that lack of focus on this record.
You want a little less coherence to the 1975.
Yeah. And so it's one that I may come back to later and be like, oh my gosh, this is such a vibe. It's so amazing. I just found myself missing the old them a little bit on this one.
How much of that do you think is the fact that for the first time they brought in another producer? Their drummer George and Maddie do most of the producing. But for this album, they brought in Jack Antonoff. So do you think that is part of the problem, or at least part of why it doesn't have as much variance?
I feel like...
What do you think? Are you a Jack Antonoff fan, I guess?
No. No, and in fact, I saw this amazing video. I think it was on Twitter, or maybe it was YouTube. I can't remember, but this amazing video of this guy doing a first listen of the Taylor Swift Midnights record, and within the first 5 seconds being able to tell whether Jack Antonoff was the producer on the track or not. And he did it with 100% accuracy. I mean, it was uncanny to watch this guy listen to this album live and just a moment of a song and know that it was Jack's production. And I would just say, and I don't,
You don't hate him.
Now that you're saying, I don't hate anybody.
Yeah.
Now that you're saying, that you reminded me that he produced or co-produced this 1975 record. I kind of want to attribute it to his involvement, but it's not as upfront in my listening experience
Yeah.
as maybe it is on some other things. But I would just say, in general, Jack Antonoff is probably played out a little bit as a producer.
Yeah.
And
it's like everybody who talks about him is like he's a great guy to work with, which you appreciate that because there's so many producers that just seem kind of like nightmares. But yeah, there's some artists, and I think 1975 is different because they've done their own production so much. But so many artists, like when you make it too easy, there's less creativity, right? Like he's not gonna push you as hard. And so like there's some point where it becomes so easy to work with someone that you're not getting your best. And yeah, I think that kind of, to me, is sometimes the problem with like his production with Taylor Swift and like several of the albums he did last year, like with Lana Del Rey. But I don't hate him. I think he does. Again, he's kind of similar. What he does well. But sometimes that works, and sometimes it could be done better.
Look, if you're gonna work with a super producer, I'd like to see fewer bands working with Jack Antonoff and more bands working with John Congleton.
Mm.
And I just think the world would be a better place if you had more people. And so my charge to the 1975 or Lana Del Rey or Taylor Swift or any of the other thousands of artists who are subcontracting Jack Antonoff right now is give John Congleton a chance. You know what? You know what I really want to hear? I want to hear a 1975 record produced by Dave Fridman. Like,
okay.
Give me a 1975 with those like maxed out Flaming Lips drums, like where they're just obliterating the equalizer every time they hit. And
yeah, because
give me some Fridman action on
originally apparently they worked a little bit with BJ Burton, who's done work with Bon Iver and Low, and it just didn't quite work out. But he's someone who does a lot of noise and sometimes challenging sort of stuff. And to me, it makes sense after the last album that I kind of like that they did something that was more focused and distilled. But yeah, the next album, I would love it if they got back to let's try a lot of different stuff and let's make a little more noise. So I've loved this album, but yeah, I hope they don't just keep repeating this over and over. But like I said, it's very focused, but I think it does have this overall message, right? Like one of the last lines is, "The only time I feel it might get better is when we are together," which, cliche, but hey, it's true. But what I actually love about that last track is it ends with it's very quiet, but it has that anxious piano sound from the opening track, kind of indicating like, hey, yeah, the anxiety's still there, right? Like we haven't solved all of this, kind of in contrast to the Kendrick record. It's still all there, and we can find hope and meaning in relationships, but it's not going away. It's not getting better, really, but we can still find love here. All right, what was something else of yours kind of near the top of the list? Like I said, you and I could spend hours talking about this, but podcast, we want to keep it tight. So what's something that you love this year?
The world doesn't want to hear it. Well, I feel like we need to talk about The Smile.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're high on your list. They were number 3 on my list.
Okay, I think I had it number 4.
Yeah, A Light for Attracting Attention. And look, I mean, this has been said, it's been written in a lot of places, but I just want to say it out loud again. This is a Radiohead record.
Yeah.
It's a Radiohead record.
Apologies to the other 3 guys in Radiohead that were not on this record. But
well, when I listened to it, and I listened to Tom Skinner from Sons of Kemet play the drums, like he plays the drums like a jazz drummer's version of Phil Selway.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like Phil's spirit is present here.
Yeah.
And I think that both Johnny and Tom kind of switch back and forth on bass duties. And I think a lot of the bass lines on this record have a Colin Greenwood, a decidedly Colin Greenwood vibe to them.
Mm-hmm.
I think what this record really proves is that it probably finally confirms what has long been expected, which is that like Radiohead never needed Ed O'Brien. I think that's what this record really shows at the end of the
All
day.
right, there's your hot take.
Is that I've seen a lot of videos of Radiohead playing in the basement, in Nigel Godrich's basement.
Mm-hmm.
And Ed's got the harmonies and Ed's got the little shaker, and he does the little 2-note plinky plinky thing on some of those tracks. But we both know that he didn't write any of that. And so I think listening to this record confirms that. I'll also say, just in the vein, while I'm on hot takes, just in the vein of the statement, this is a Radiohead record, to me, this is a super like natural progression from a Moon-Shaped Pool in the style, in the way the songs work, and the way they sound. And there's a bunch of tracks on this album that feel like they are like siblings of tracks from a Moon-Shaped Pool.
Mm-hmm. Even the album art kind of like it's sort of similar.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that.
And so it just feels like a Radiohead record, and a really, really good one.
Mm-hmm.
Like it would probably be, if you talk about like Kid A, In Rainbows, OK Computer, Amnesiac, a Moon-Shaped Pool, and probably this, if I were like off the top of my head, like ranking Radiohead or Radiohead adjacent records.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, I know you probably have a lot of words on this one because you're much more of a lyrics guy than I am, but Free in the Knowledge, it's a top 10 Tom York song. There.
Yeah, that was the song I was going to talk about. That's the one that made it on my songs of the year. I don't rank like my favorite songs necessarily, but that was the one that, yeah.
Free in the knowledge that one day this will end. Free in the knowledge that everything has changed.
That summed up this year pretty well too. So yeah, like you said, it's of all the Radiohead side projects or adjacent things or solo albums, yeah, this feels the most. It really is just a Radiohead record. And I mean, talk about bands that have staying power, that have lost none of their ability to speak to the moment and name that anxiety, but also create beauty out of it. And yeah, Tom York is just beautifully entering his wizard phase. This big long beard and stuff. So yeah, I loved it. I didn't have a lot of specific things to say about it, but it names this moment so well. It's doing different things where the songs don't all sound the same, but they all fit together so well. Yeah, it's just amazing that for 30 years they've been so consistent. Tom and Johnny especially. So yeah, I definitely love this album.
So I saw Radiohead on the King of Limbs tour. And I believe that night, for the first time ever, they debuted Skirting on the Surface.
Really?
During that show. It may have been the second time they played it. I can't remember, folks who pay really close attention to track lists and things like that.
Check Reddit.
Check Reddit. Yeah. I could be wrong, but it was one of the first times they'd ever played it live, Skirting on the Surface. And that was 2010 on that tour. So it's really interesting to hear that song again as the closing track here, 12 years later, and sounding very similar as I recall, very similar to what I heard in the arena that night. And it immediately called back True Love Waits.
Mm-hmm. Which also, existed for a long time.
Which existed for forever before it was on the record. And it makes, and then of course you remember the song Nude from In Rainbows was an old Radiohead track that they brought back. And it just makes me wonder, listening to some of these things on The Smile, as we hear more from The Smile and we know they're writing, they're already writing their second record right now.
Yeah.
They're debuting songs from that. And it just makes me wonder, like, how many more gems do
they
Tom
just
and
have in the
Johnny
vault.
have,
Yep.
like, in the vault
Mm-hmm.
that we're going to hear over the course of the next few years through either Radiohead or The Smile or whatever, that are just things these guys have been holding on to that are all time, like, great, tracks.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and they've been sitting in somebody's inbox for 15 years.
Yep. All right. Well, let me hit a couple others real quick before we get to a couple other of our favorites. One that, speaking of albums that came out pretty recently, Weyes Blood, her album in the Darkness, Hearts Aglow. Yeah, it came out like a couple weeks ago, so it's hard to really say, but I have really loved it so far. Natalie Merring just sounds like Karen Carpenter. Like, if you're not paying a lot of attention, you just think, oh, is this a Carpenter song? So she has this kind of 70s singer-songwriter, Laurel Canyon sound to her. But yeah, and I liked her last album, but this one, it just really hit. And especially the lead single, It's Not Just Me, It's Everybody. I mean, just saying that, right? Again, this is, to me, just a great summary of, okay, how do we find meaning in this moment? And so much of that song, it's the first song on the album as well, so it sets the tone.
Mercy is the only cure for being so lonely. Has the time ever been more revealing that people are hurting?
It just works so well that we're all part of one big thing. And so it's this call for unity and community in the midst of what we're enduring. And I think she's kind of said this is part of a trilogy, and a lot of it is, her last record especially was naming like the climate crisis and these sort of things. But there was so much more hope in this one, and just beautiful to listen to, like her singing and the production on it. Another one that I liked, Beyonce's. Kind of similar to Kendrick Lamar, her album Renaissance, where it goes up or down in my judgment depending on how I feel at the moment. It's a dance record, and it kind of just does one thing. I mean, there are different genres within it, but it's all centered around that. Break My Soul, came out as the lead single, as this kind of 90s house sound. Which again, that may not be everybody's sound. That's not usually my sound. I'm not going to the club, so it's a good album, like when I'm working out and like I need that energy. Like, it has a lot of energy, but I'm not always in the mood for it. And like it doesn't feel like it's saying a whole lot other than like love yourself. I think after my first listen, I shared the meme from Arrested Development in that scene where it's Job is in charge of the company and he's starting the Christmas party early. And he's like, everybody dance now, because that song is playing. And then he leans into the mic. It's like, everybody dance now. Like, that is Renaissance. So I enjoyed it, but it's not one I'm going to go back to all the time, because it's kind of doing such a unique thing. Again, kind of like Kendrick Lamar.
Anytime you can get an Arrested Development reference into a podcast is a good day.
There you go. All right. So what are some others that you love this year? Some of your top ones?
Yeah. So others that I really enjoyed, the Florist record. It's self-titled. Mm-hmm. I think it's 19 tracks, and more than half of them are sort of found sound and or like jam experiments with no lyrics. And if I listen to the Florist record and the Big Thief record back to back, on any given day, I like the Florist record better.
Really? Okay.
But when you start to compare like songs, when you start to compare like songwriting, the Big Thief record is far and away better. But the record as a whole and the way it flows, if you're talking about like sort of like the sort of natural state sort of folk rock thing, I think the Florist record is really, really good. And I probably like, I can't remember her name for the life of me right now, but probably like her voice a little bit better than Adrian Linker's.
Yeah, that is the hardest thing with Big Thief. We'll get to them in a minute.
Get to them in a minute.
Oh,
and then
Emily Sprague.
Emily Sprague, that's right. Yeah. She's really great. And then there was kind of an alt country record that came out this year by a band called Friendship, and the album is called Love the Stranger. And it's just a really great like alt country album, and it's very hopeful and very, I mean, the vibe is in the title of the record.
Oh,
um
as a
and
preacher, I can get on board with that sentiment.
oh yeah, it's great. It just feels great to listen to, and it's one of those, it's a really great like road trip album.
Mm.
And then probably of course, love the Alabaster Deplume album, but it's definitely an acquired taste. And then the other one, just to mention before we get into sort of the big ones near the top, is Angel Olsen, Big Time,
Mm.
which I just absolutely loved. Huge Lucinda Williams vibes on that, even more than usual for Angel Olsen. There's some Dolly Parton going on there. It's just a big hearted, big voiced, warm, like country album.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that I love about it the most is, if you've listened to Angel Olsen over the course of, her like career trajectory, and she's always been kind of a critical darling, but there are several songs across her discography where you can just feel this like really fierce rock and roll edge, like
Mm-hmm.
just right under the surface. And every now and then there's a track where it breaks through, like Shut Up Kiss Me, off of one of her records from a couple of records ago. But on this album, taking that like really intense, dramatic, dirty, messy rock and roll thing, and smashing that at the end of these beautiful sweeping country tracks, which she does multiple times across the record, just makes for a super compelling listen. And All the Good Times, which is the leadoff track on that album, one of my top five songs of the year. But when that song like explodes in the last minute, I mean, it's just one of those ones where like you want windows down, you want to be screaming this thing, and it's great.
And the way that she said, as heavy as lead, you've always known how to get straight to my head. Thanks for the free ride and all of the good times.
So yeah, so that probably rounds out, my 5 through 10, which kind of leaves, a couple.
Right. So let's talk about Big Thief, because we've been circling around him a lot. So this album, you gotta love the album title, Dragon New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You. I actually had this as my number one, which surprised me a little bit, because this is a band, like, they're very prolific. Either the band itself or Adrian Linker has put out a solo album pretty much every year, sometimes 2 albums in a year. And, I've liked those albums, but I never like fully loved them. And this one it just grabbed me. Like, it's just, I mean, this is a line from the title track, but it's just magic. So this album came out early in the year, and it's stuck with me through the year. But we took a road trip out to California over spring break, which I do not recommend with 2 young children, but we did. And we saw, Grand Canyon and all that stuff. But there's a point where going through most of California, right, it's just desert and stuff.
Yeah.
But then you get to the mountains. And I was listening to this album, and I think it was the title track, as we were like coming over the mountains and just seeing this beauty. And it was just kind of this perfect, magical moment.
It's a little bit magic, like a river of morning geese.
And so whether or not you have that kind of experience listening to it, as we've said, this is an album where they do just throw everything at the wall, everything and the kitchen sink. It's a double album, which, that doesn't mean as much these days unless you're buying vinyl, which to me, like the quintessential first double album like that is the White Album from the Beatles. And so it's doing a similar thing. And it's always a risky proposition, because it either works or it doesn't. It's, like I said, I tend to like shorter albums where they do what they're meant to do and they're focused. But this one, it works, right? Like, I never feel the length, even though it's like 20 songs. It's doing so many different things, and yet there's this voice through it, and the songwriting, like you said. It's ambitious, but it's effortless. So, what did you love about this Big Thief record?
And I really loved their last full length. So they had UFOF and they had Two Hands. And
Yeah.
I love both those records, but I really loved Two Hands. And the thing I loved about Two Hands was, and I think at the time they'd written about how they went to the studio in El Paso and they just jammed out in the studio in El Paso, and how the being at the border during the late Trump years with all the things going on with immigration and everything, like just imbued the record with a pathos and a sort of an empathetic tone that you feel throughout it. And so the fact that they, for this record, went to like 4 different locations and recorded 4 songs in 4 different locations, you know, and kind of mixed them in here, you know, I don't know that I would hear that if I were listening to it without knowing that, but having known that, it definitely shapes some of the listen, and the album just feels like a journey. And I think the songs themselves, they're just so great, and they're great like pop songs. They're great. I mean, you mentioned the White Album, and I agree. You know, I agree. It's, you know, it's kind of, yeah. I wrote in my notes like, this is the Big Thief's White Album.
Yeah. I mean, the cover is white with like a pencil.
The cover is white, but I would actually say, if I were comparing it to an actual Beatles album, to me, this is more Rubber Soul. And you know, it's shaggy in places, and you know, it's got experimental sounds in some places, but they're not going all the way in on it, and just doing some really interesting things. And the songs themselves are just really tight, and really, I mean, from one track to the next, really solid. And
yeah, like, even though the tracks, like one is a country song and the other is like kind of a glitch sort of song, like it still works, right? I don't know how,
it still
but
works.
It flows.
I also think the record's like got this really awesome like lived in sound. Like it's like you can hear there's studio noise, and there's like rough takes, and there's mistakes, and there's off key, you know, pitching in some places, and there's some
like
missed beats,
talking to each other
in the studio, talking to the dog, I think, in one of the songs, like but that mess that's kind of going on throughout the record is part of the art. And the sketch on the front of the album, where it's like this little chintzy sort of pencil sketch of these animals playing around a fire, to me is just very indicative of the overall experience. Which, this was my number 2 record, and I loved every single minute of it. And it would, you know, if my number 1 record hadn't come out this year and I wasn't so obsessed with it, this would have been a runaway number 1 for me.
Yeah, it's like I said, this is not a band that like I've always loved, so that's how I know. Like, it's not just because I'm a fanboy of this group, which is kind of how I feel about the 1975 sometimes. But yeah, they're doing so many things, but it doesn't feel like they're trying too hard. And like their songs is this song a joke or is it totally sincere? Like Spud Infinity.
When I say infinity, I mean now. Kiss the one you are right now. Kiss your body up and down, other than your elbows.
It's kind of both, right? And talk about, you know, loving yourself. It works. All of it works. And again, the idea, another through line like the 1975 is love is all that matters. When all material scatters and ashes amplify, the only place that matters is by your side. I think that's like the second to last track, The Only Place. And it's, again, the way it's sung, the way it's done is just beautiful. It is magic, and that's why I loved it. So the last album we're going to talk about is, it was number 3 on mine. It was number 1 on yours, and you're the one that introduced it to me. So let's talk about Gang of Youth's Angel in Real Time. So what did you love about this album? You said you listened to this more than anything else by a long shot this year. So how did it connect with you?
Yeah, I can't remember the last time I listened to a record as much as I've listened to this one. And I listened, you know, we were talking about 1975 earlier and talking about A Brief Inquiry into Online Relationships. I listened to that one a whole lot. Like, if you could wear out MP3s, I would have worn that those MP3s out. Yeah. But I listened to this one more. And it's really interesting reading how different like music journalists and critics have talked about this album, because it's been a real mixed bag. Like, some listen to this record and they feel the way about it that I feel about it, which I'll get into in a second. Some listen to this record and they're like, this is way over the top. There's way too many ideas. There's, they don't like the way that David LaPepe, however you say his name, sings, or the way he writes, or,
dances.
Dances. There's a lot of sort of criticism of what they're bringing to the table, but man, am I here for it. I think probably the nearest analog I can think of listening to this and experiencing this record would be probably how I felt the first time I listened to Arcade Fire's The Funeral.
Oh yeah.
And I just remember listening to that song. And now like 20 years later, I listen to The Funeral and I think, what a bright-eyed, wide-eyed, dopey boy I was to like love this sing-along, whoa, sort of sounds so much and to be so captured by it. But then I listened to this Gang of Youths album and everything I felt about that, like the heart of it, the exposed nerves, these like devastating turns of phrase that he sprinkles all over this record. The big choruses, the big verses, the big instrumentation, the just amount of stuff that gets loaded into these songs, and the amount of cathartic. I mean, there are so many moments of cathartic release on this record. You're almost exhausted by the time it ends. and there are multiple times through the album where 100 listens on to a song like Goal of the Century, which is the closing track, or You and Everything, which is the opening track, or Forbearance, 100 listens on, I still tear up listening to it. And it's something special for music to have that kind of like visceral physical effect. And so I just could not get enough of it. And it reminds me of, I mentioned Arcade Fire. The first time I ever heard the first 3 tracks on Joshua Tree, the first time you listen to the first 3 tracks on Joshua Tree, you're like, holy crap, I'm going to jump over a mountain right now.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, Bono is definitely a touch point for the way that he sings. And I mean, literally his voice sometimes sounds like Bono. And
oh my gosh.
Yeah, like especially I'd say like the 2000 kind of era U2, huge choruses. And yeah, for some people it's not going to work because it seems kind of cheesy, but like if it works, it works. And I think it does. I know it definitely did for you. And this is one that I missed it when it came out. And so it's thanks to you that I heard about it. And, one of the reasons you told me I need to listen to it is kind of the story behind the album is that the songwriter, his dad died. And so it's, an album about grief, but then also that his dad had actually fathered 2 other sons that he didn't know about until I think it was when he passed, or at least around that time. And so kind of like coming to terms with his father's legacy and grieving his loss, but also his complicated feelings about how he had this whole other side. And like the track Brothers really gets into all this and reveals a lot. But, you have songs that are kind of written from the dad's perspective and kind of asking for forgiveness, but maybe not expecting it. And so it's interesting that he's putting himself in his dad's shoes, and that was the way he was coping with it. I went and saw John Mulaney this year for stand-up, and he had this bit. It's, you weren't allowed to record anything, so I can't remember word for word, but he was doing this whole thing about, it started with, how you say your grandparents have died so you can get out of school, and it's kind of like the kid's first experience with death when somebody's grandparent dies. But then he kept going and he talked about like, guys get weird when their dad dies. Like, just watch out when somebody loses their dad. And no album, like you were saying, has made me weep more because as I'm sure I've mentioned on here before, my dad passed away a couple years ago, and so much of this hit real hard, even though I didn't have that same kind of complicated relationship with my dad. If you've lost someone, especially if you've lost your dad, just beware when you listen to this album. I like, tears don't come easy for me, but this is probably the thing in all pop culture that has helped me, and that catharsis is so important and necessary and And it does that, and like you said, it does it with these huge choruses. Every song feels like a climax almost, but like the last 4 songs are just like perfection, the way they flow into each other. And You and Everything is wow, just so powerful. And I mean, I know why it connects with me. Why do you think it connected with you so much when you haven't experienced that particular loss like he did? Do you think there's something universal about this, even without having gone through that exact kind of grief?
Yeah, I think for me, without getting too personal.
Yeah, we're not going to do the Kendrick thing and start doing a
Yeah.
therapy session.
Yeah, without getting too personal, I hadn't heard that anecdote from John Mulaney, but it's very fitting. And I think part of the reason that people get weird when their dads pass is that we particularly, I think men have really complex relationships with their dads.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it's a 100% positive relationship and everything is great, it's still complex.
Yeah.
And I think I have a complex, and again, without getting too personal, I have a complex relationship with my own dad.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though I haven't lost my dad, there are a number of moments on this record where he is reckoning with who his dad was, who he thought his dad was, or this specter of like who his dad wanted him to be and who he really was, and or who he was going to be, who his dad would not get to experience.
Yeah.
And because he had passed away. And that's happening in a bunch of different places across this record. I think every time that comes back, it connects. And if you'll permit me, we haven't spent a ton of time talking about lyrics on this podcast, but if you permit me, 2 very brief excerpts from 2 songs.
Please do.
The first verse and the chorus on Forbearance, which I think is the 4th to last track on the record.
Yeah, part of that, like, to me, it's the ending section.
But I think this does 2 things. Number one, I think it kind of shows the point that I'm making about the complexity and this sort of like who's seeing what through whose lens at what time sort of thing. But then also La Pepe's incredible gift for mixing the mundane with the weighty, which he does over and over and over again, which makes the big hit sort of moments punch even harder because he mixes this mundane, regular sort of conversational language with these really heady ideas. And so on Forbearance, he begins this song like, "It was a gracious old sunshine, but it was wasted on me. I was plastered and counting cop cars out right in front of me. I was a troublesome young kid. I was a big piece of shit, but I'm hoping that the days in the hospice atone for some of it."
If the whole thing was fair, it would be me that was fighting for it. But it's you and the bear, and it's so routine that it just threw me, I get. And in the cosmic ballet, you can't just do what you fucked up again. And the world is not done with me yet.
And I hear that, and it's so big, but it's so simply put. It's really incredible. And then the other one I just wanted to highlight because the other one is the last stanza from Goal of the Century, which is the last track on the record. And I think it captures the whole idea of absence and presence and misconnection and all this sort of stuff that's throughout the record. And it ends.
My brothers are calling, the rabbits are chasing, Ricardo is racing, and I'm making a living. God is forgiving, and it's 6 a.m. And England is storming. My wife is asleep and we're thinking of children. I wish you could meet them.
I mean, I don't know, man. It kills me every time. Even reading it right now, I'm like a little bit weepy about it.
Yeah.
It's so good.
Yeah, and you know what I love about it too is like it's specific, right? Like you can tell this is the specific things that he was doing, where he was when his dad passed or right after, and yet it's in that specificity that it feels universal. Like that's why you need big choruses, and that's why you got to sing like Bono, because it is so big, those feelings, and like I can't express. I'm not a big feeling person like that, and to me, this is the beauty of pop culture, and I think especially music, is that it can get you to that place. It can do that powerful thing, and yeah, maybe it appeals to us because we're dudes and have complicated relationships with our dads, living or not. But yeah, it's so much a part of the human experience. I love both of those songs and lines that you mentioned. Another highlight for me is The Man Himself, which is also there in those last 4 tracks, where it is like thinking about what kind of man am I going to be? I want to be my own man, I guess, is part of the chorus. I don't know what to feel. I don't know how to feel right now. As a dad with kids, young kids, I mean, there's a line in the song about there's a painting of you that hangs in the kitchen, and I'm going to look to it when my kids are going crazy, which is like, yeah, I have that painting of my dad, and my kids are going crazy. And the bridge at the end is like, okay, so what do you do?
So take a single step at a simple pace, and the outward momentum will maybe unfold you in time. So comb your hair and clean your teeth, dial back home at least once or twice a week, and be sure they don't see them a lot more than I did with mine.
Like that's all it is, right? You just take that single step, and as we're kind of summing up and closing here, it's like, yeah, what in the midst of all the grief of life, your specific grief and losses that you've experienced, or the big picture stuff and all the injustice and disparity and all these things, what do? You just take that single step and get moving, move towards love, move towards community. It's not a coincidence, I don't think, that this is what appealed to me, what drew me in, because I think that is what we need in this moment. And that's what I loved about pretty much all of my favorite albums and songs this year.
It was a feely year, and I'm here. I'm really glad that it was.
Yeah.
It needed to be.
Yeah, we needed it. All right. Well, I will post on Pop Culture Pastor my official top 10, and I'll have my playlist of my top songs of the year. So I talked about most of them. There's a few others, and so just follow me there for more on that. And Blake, I know you'll be posting some as well, maybe. I know you're not as much on social media, but maybe we'll get some of that, or you can share it so people can see. And like I said on the last episode about my books of the year, we're not here to gatekeep or say you have to listen to this. This is the good music. This is what connected with us and impacted us, and we just hope that it opens up more for you. I mean, there are things that you recommended that I was adding to my library as we were talking. So find something that can give you more wonder and appreciation for life. That's the evangelism that we're here for. So I hope you find something that will give you those feels that you need in this moment.
I'm glad we're ending on these 2 records because they made me really happy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks for talking with us, Blake. Thanks for sharing things that we can love. I always appreciate you. The day this drops, we're going to see the 1975. So that's also going to be a joyful experience, I hope. I'm sure Maddie will do some weird stuff too. But
in our suits, suits.
That's our aesthetic. All right. Well, thanks for being on the show, Blake. We will see you again soon.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, now we come to the close of the show, and we have to talk about what really matters. It's one of the songs that I love says, it's not just me, it's everybody. Everybody is dealing with their pain and their hurts all this year, and yet we're all bound together by that pain. And there are things that we can turn to that we've heard in all these songs that can bring us joy and give us meaning. But not everybody has access to all of them. Not everybody has heard about this podcast. So it's up to you. You need to share. You need to subscribe. You need to tell your friends so that they can be part of this everybody, that we can experience this joy and wonder together that comes through Pop Culture Pastor. Well, that concludes our show today. Pop Culture Pastor is produced by me. Thanks again to my guest, Blake Jackson, for being on the show. I said at the start we would give him a niche title, so I'm now going to proclaim him the Geriatric Millennial Music Consultant. So thanks, Blake. If you want more from me, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Pop Culture Pastor. And there you can find my top 10 lists as well as my playlist of music of 2022. So check those out. Next week, we're talking about the TV and movies of 2022. So I'll see you in 1 week then. Don't forget that you can be a part of our special Consolations and Desolations episode that's coming in 2 weeks. So send a voice memo to popculturepp@gmail.com. Include your name and something that you loved this year, something that was life-giving, and something that was not life-giving in 2022 in the pop culture landscape. So we'll see you next time. You are now dismissed. Go in peace.